program for the study of women and gender here at Smith. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the program for supporting this event and thank Susan Van Dyne for the inspiration to make it happen. Susan, wave back there. I'd like to thank our program's administrative assistant, Rachel Siegel, who is not here today, but who has been critical in organizing this entire faculty seminar and event. And so it's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers, Urvashi Vaught and Dean Spade. Urvashi is a community organizer, writer, and attorney who has been a leader in the LGBT and social justice movements for nearly 3 decades. She is currently the director of the Engaging Tradition Project at the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School. The project seeks to understand how the idea of tradition is used by and used against movements for gender and sexual justice, and to explore how tradition-based practices inform, enable, and/or limit the work of these movements. Urvashi is the author of Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race, Class, and the Assumptions of LGBT Politics, which is recent, last year, I believe, and also Virtual Equality, the Mainstreaming of Gay and Lesbian Liberation, a political analysis of the U.S. LGBT movement. She is also co-editor with Dr. John D'Amelio and Dr. William Turner of an anthology of public history titled Creating Change, Public Policy, Sexuality, and Civil Rights. And she's been a columnist in The Advocate. Vaught is founder of LPAC, the first lesbian political action committee, which was launched in July of 2012. She serves on the board of directors of the Gill Foundation and is the founder of the Vaught Group, a consulting practice that advises individuals and organizations working to achieve social justice in a wide range of fields. She's the recipient of many awards. She has been the executive director of the Arcus Foundation and the deputy director of the Governance and Civil Society Unit of the Ford Foundation. Before that, she was with the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and was its executive director from 1989 to 1992. And before that time, she was a staff attorney at the National Prison Project of the ACLU. And she's also a graduate of Vassar and of Northeastern University School of Law. Our second guest today is Dean Spade, who is an associate professor at Seattle University School of Law. He teaches administrative law, poverty law, and law and social movements. Prior to joining the faculty of Seattle University, Dean was a Williams Institute Law Teaching Fellow at UCLA Law School and at Harvard Law School, teaching classes related to sexual orientation and gender identity, law, and law and social movements. In 2002, Dean founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit law collective that provides free legal services to transgender, intersex, and gender non-conforming people who are low-income and/or people of color. SRLP also engages in litigation, policy reform, and public education on issues affecting these communities and operates on a collective governance model, prioritizing the governance and leadership of trans, intersex, and gender non-conforming people of color. From 1998 to 2006, Dean co-edited the paper and online zine Make, and is currently the co-editor of the online journal Enough, which focuses on the personal politics of wealth redistribution. Dean is currently a fellow at the Engaging Tradition Project at Columbia Law School, and his book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law, was published in 2011. So today, Urvashi and Dean are going to have a conversation about the current state of LGBT and queer politics. This event is the culmination of a thought-provoking and inspiring 2-day faculty seminar led by Urvashi and Dean with a lot of faculty from here at Smith. We are so grateful for the respectful, productive, intergenerational dialogue that we have witnessed and participated in over the last 2 days. We've learned so much, and I know you will too. Finally, I want to thank the staff members at the college who have set up the rooms, prepared and put out the food, and cleaned up after our meetings. I appreciate that a lot. So please join me in welcoming Urvashi Vaught and Dean Spade.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you everybody for being here. It's really been a fun and a wonderful couple of days. I really want to appreciate the faculty who took time, a lot of time, today, last night, today, to spend with us. We both learned a lot. We're going to talk about, and the format for today that we decided on is that I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, Dean's going to talk for about 20 minutes, we're going to talk to each other for a few minutes, and then we're going to ask you to talk with us. So that's basically what we're going to do. And what we're going to talk about is a conversation that we've been having with each other for several years, but one that exists in the social justice movements and in the queer movements for some time. And it's a conversation about institutionalization and the pros and cons of that. It's a conversation about nonprofitization and how the institutionalization of social movements into nonprofits changes them. Or perhaps you will say it doesn't change them, but I believe it does. And we wanted to create a space to think critically and imaginatively about that. And so we organized a conference in October that was called Queer Dreams and Nonprofit Blues. How many of you were there? I know some people from Smith came because I met them, actually. And we had 500 people show up. Over 2 days. And it was a really interesting conversation. So imagine you're a Smith graduate who wants to do queer work, for example. You want to join the movement, like I did when I got out of college. What do? Well, you try to get a job, right? And then the people you apply to tell you, well, they barely have any money, they have no openings, and the openings they have, they're all administrative or whatever. They're working in an arena in which you don't want to work. Then you think to yourself, well, maybe I'll get a fellowship. And you look around and there's like maybe one in the country or 3 that you might be eligible for, and there's 3,000 people applying. Then you might fall back on some parenting privilege or economic privilege if you have it and say, well, I'll just do an unpaid internship at this organization. And after a while, you kind of give up and you decide, well, I'm just going to go to grad school. Or I'm going to go the business track. Or some of you might say, well, you know, what I want to do doesn't exist and I'm going to start my own organization. And then you start your own organization. So imagine a startup. You've got to find funders. And that takes you down another road of organizations and institutions that are in the nonprofit sector. Foundations, private foundations, public foundations, corporate foundations, family foundations. You discover this whole universe, and you start writing grants. And then you realize that, gosh, all these foundations have like their own agenda and their own priorities, and this one differs from that one, even though they all say they're working on LGBT stuff, right? They all have their theories of change. Then imagine that you do get one of those few jobs in an organization. What power would you have as a junior staffer? What happens in those organizations if you're a client of a service organization? What power do people those organizations serve have to make decisions? What role do members in those organizations play? These are the kinds of questions that we're thinking about when we talk about nonprofitization. What happens to movements that become institutionalized and what happens inside those institutions. So when I started working in the queer movement in Boston in the late 70s, that's where I went after college to join the women's movement. That was my dream at that time. And I read that there was a big movement there. Formal women's organizations and formally organized LGBT organizations were so rare. They barely existed. What I did was I got a job as a secretary and for a couple of lawyers. I got the job out of the Boston Globe, classifieds. They looked at me and said, what are you doing with a bachelor degree? You want to be a secretary? I said, I want to join the movement. And so I need a job. And so that's what I did. I worked, and then I did my political work because there was so little opportunity to even work in the movement in that way. But the reality was that most of the movement was being done in a whole different way than it is right now. Most of the organizations that existed, lesbian and gay media advocates, the All Student Right and Green Light Safe House Project, Lesbians United for Non-Nuclear Action, the feminist caucus of the Boston Food Co-op, the Gay Community News. You know, most of these groups were volunteer-driven, volunteer groups, and GCN, Gay Community News, had a staff of 10 people who were paid like $50 a week, and they all had extra jobs to make a living. And we were not registered, organized around goals, values, decision-making processes, and theories of governance and accountability that did not run through the nonprofit system of the state. Funders for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Issues, which is a affinity group of queer foundations and non-gay foundations that support LGBT issues. They did a report about 40 years of LGBT philanthropy that you can find on their website, in which they noted that in 1969, there were perhaps 50 LGBT organizations. When you think to today, I mean, that's really something, isn't it? Those groups back then had, in the 60s and 70s, had to fight the government to even get formal governmental approval. Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, for example, now known as Lambda Legal, the oldest legal rights organization, was formed in 1973. And Lambda had to become its own first client. A New York judicial panel rejected Lambda's application to be a nonprofit organization because, in their view, their mission was neither benevolent nor charitable. Lambda used pro bono lawyers to appeal to New York's highest court, which ultimately allowed Lambda Legal to come into existence as a nonprofit organization. Today, large parts of queer work are dominated by this formally organized sector. The Movement Advancement Project, which is a think tank that documents and tracks LGBT organizations, which you can find on the web. Movement Advancement Project looked at the GuideStar database to identify about 501 active LGBT-focused organizations in that database. GuideStar puts up on its database every organization that files a tax return to the IRS. And if you're an organization that raises more than $5,000, you file a tax return to the IRS. So they found 501 LGBT-focused nonprofits that spent about $589 million in 2012. And then they went deeper and they surveyed about 36 of those organizations, which accounted for 165 million. So the context, the reality is that the nonprofit sector exists, but as I'll talk about a little later, in the context of the overall, of the LGBT nonprofit sector exists, but in the context of the overall nonprofit sector, you'll see that it's quite tiny to this day. But I want to talk a minute about the overall context for nonprofits in which they came into being and consider about this as we think about how to think about the relationship between social movements and formally organized entities called nonprofits, right? This fight that we've had to shut down the federal government, and that you recall over the last few seasons of the Obama administration we've had to deal with, the fight has deep roots in U.S. history. On a political level, it's a fight against federalism and about the role of government in the provision of social support systems. But it bears noting that opposition to an expanded role for government in addressing poverty and in providing for the general good has long been fueled by two things: by white resentment at having to address the legacies of slavery and racism, and by the anti-communist, anti-statist ideologies that dominated U.S. domestic and foreign policy for more than 50 years into the 50s. The federal government's role in the provision of supportive services and its reliance on voluntary associations to do this expanded first in the aftermath of the Civil War. The period of Reconstruction saw the emergence of, quote, what Peter Dobkin Hall, the historian of nonprofits, has called, quote, new power for national organizations, parties, media, and the growth of the voluntary sector, unquote. And this expansion, back then, was resisted strongly by political leaders from southern states. Two other expansions of the federal role in addressing social needs emerged after the Depression, through the New Deal, and in the 1960s, through the War on Poverty. Under the New Deal, the federal government implemented social insurance programs like unemployment insurance, Social Security, pensions, created a framework for workers' rights and labor laws, instituted the first income tax in 1943. This expansion was vehemently resisted by conservatives and by industrial leaders who feared that the expansion of communism, that this was like the expansion of communism and socialism in the United States, because government was going to do all these things. When the social support service system framework was expanded again in the 1960s and 1970s through the War on Poverty programs, which were like food stamps, VISTA, Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, Head Start, it was resisted again by those who argued that the social safety net would create a dependency that would undermine people's willingness to work and thus undermine free enterprise. So as government commitments and regulations grew and required higher taxes, and deficit spending, anti-tax, anti-government, libertarian, and conservative movements began to organize more actively. Their intellectual leaders, like Lewis Powell, who went on to become a Supreme Court Justice, William Simon, who was Treasury Secretary, and the Heritage Foundation, among others, articulated a political and economic ideology: small government, less regulation, a big defense sector, and the unfettered expansion of corporations. Their strategists forged alliances across previously isolated corners of the right and connected economic conservatives with religious and cultural conservatives who were worried about the impact of new social movements that were changing the power women had in society, by the demand for racial equity and redistribution, and by gay rights. Now, I gave you this history, so stay with me. It's interesting. Ronald Reagan's presidency gave power to these reactionaries for the first time. And his mission was to dismantle the welfare state as it had come to be known in the 1960s and 1970s and install the neoliberal state, which was built upon deregulation, free trade, less taxation for corporations, privatization of services previously done by government, the devolution of services down to the local governmental level, and the aggressive use of monetary and trade policy to expand the reach of markets. And aided by technological shifts, the economic basis of the U.S. economy moved away from the production of goods to the production of technology and the outsourcing of services. Clinton and Bush II continued the work that Reagan and Bush I began, cutting government programs and welfare, privatizing government programs through contracting and outsourcing, and expanding criminalization and surveillance, and increasing the military and police powers of the state. Now, the Tea Party movement, a movement that's been hatched in the corporate suites of the Koch brother-funded think tanks and strategy firms, must be seen as just the latest manifestation of the carefully executed strategy for this kind of shrinkage of the federal government and of social dominance that's been mapped out by right-wing funders and activists. It's been achieved through a systematic construction of a policy, legal, political, intellectual, grassroots, media, and philanthropic infrastructure that is aimed at keeping social control for its owners. The results have been phenomenal. Conservatives helped elect presidents in 1980, 84, 88, and 2000. They won conservative majorities in the Senate, 94, 2002, 4, 6, 8, 12 in the House. And they won major gains in gubernatorial and state legislatures. Amidst all this change, and this change in the evolution of the neoliberal state, the nonprofit sector has grown dramatically. In a way, the nonprofit sector serves, as Miranda Joseph from Arizona has brilliantly termed it, as a metonym, a substituted concept for the idea of community. Community breaks down and nonprofits rise, at the very instant that such community was being destroyed by neoliberal economic policies. Peter Dobkin Hall notes that more than 90% of today's nonprofits were formed after 1950, and most global NGOs are about 35 years old. As government funding for poverty alleviation, housing, services, health, and other social systems grew, nonprofits became the implementers and the means through which many programs were carried out. A symbiotic relationship came into being between nonprofits, government funders, corporate and private philanthropy, which then began to change in the 80s and 90s with the privatization and devolution of government programs. So how many nonprofits? About, as of 2012, according to the Urban Institute and the National Center for Charitable Statistics at the Urban Institute, about 1.58 million nonprofits registered with the IRS, and about an additional 327,000 religious organizations. Religious organizations do not have to register unless they are formally constituted as a nonprofit tax-exempt organization. Most of these nonprofits are small. Of about 1 million organizations that are formed as 501c3s, 40% report revenues under 100,000. 40% of these groups report revenues under 100,000 a year. Nonprofits with budgets over 10 million total about 4.4% of all public charities, but they account for 86% of the spending. Nonprofits are heavily funded by government, which provides about 35% of all nonprofit revenues, contracts, and grants. Nonprofits are a huge part of the workforce. They account for 10% of the total workforce, or about 13.7 million people work in nonprofits. They account for 9.2% of all salaries and wages paid in the U.S. in 2012. 5.6% of the gross domestic product. We, this must make me happy, and economic statistics. We badge it. Amherst, love her work. Speak of your report staff. Nonprofits enjoy extensive support, but 27% of the U.S. population says it's volunteered for a nonprofit. So that's a little bit of a context, right? And I'm going to close by just outlining some of the challenges that I see with this broad context for the LGBT movement in particular. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dean to go deeper. So, neoliberal policies have had this paradoxical effect. They've reduced funding available for social services, but they've increased the demand for those services through increased unemployment and dislocation and inequality and poverty. And so that's the first challenge facing the LGBT movement. And that the government at every level has less money to spend on social services at the very instant that our movement is seeking support for the lives of queer seniors, queer youth, queer homeless. We're seeking to de-incarcerate people or abolish prisons, to decriminalize, to invest in workforce and employment. There's less money to go around. And I think it's, I'm conflicted personally about nonprofits. On the one hand, I think it's really, I don't know how else we structure the work that we do except through a nonprofit form. And I've lived in 30 years of working in this movement, through the all-volunteer system to a situation where I've worked in well-funded organizations. And it really makes a difference to have the resources to support our communities and do the work. So, I also am very frustrated that so few foundations fund LGBT work to this day. We're a tiny 0.1% of all philanthropic giving goes to LGBT people. And there is a huge need in our community. So the Movement Advancement Project surveyed 79 of about 200 LGBT community centers. And it found that those 79 centers are serving about 1.7 million people a year. They see about 33,000 people come through their doors every week. And 41% of these centers report having staffs of 1 to 5 people, and 18% have no staffs at all. So you're looking at about most of these centers have very few to no staff, and they're serving all these people. So that's the need in our communities, and at the very instant that there is a need. A second challenge is that there is a growing corporatization of social services and a growing, as the government has started outsourcing, the private sector has gotten involved. And they're creating these entities that deliver services and compete with movement-based nonprofits, and often do it much more aggressively and much better. So that's, a friend of mine calls it philanthrocapitalism. And he's written a whole critique about it, like everyone's. A third challenge for queer nonprofits is that very few people in our communities actually, a third challenge for the queer movement is that the need is great, but that very, very few people in our community are actually plugged in and connected to the movement work. The Movement Advancement Project estimates that about 3% of the LGBT community actually gives to support LGBT organizations. So it's quite remarkable how much work we've gotten done, and there's very little given coming into those organizations. And so that's another set of challenges we can talk about. And finally, the challenge I want to put on the table is the challenge of what happens inside these nonprofits and how they are operated. You know, in some ways, we have mirrored the corporate world in many ways. We have just taken the structure of the nonprofit corporation from the corporate sector and implemented those same structures in our own movement organizations without too much interrogation. So there is a classic pyramid. The board is at the top, and then you have the staff, and then you have the people who are being served, right? And then you might have the community staff pyramid, like that you would see in a corporation, corporate hierarchy. But at our conference, a woman who works a lot with progressive nonprofits offered another model of how a structure could look for a nonprofit. She said that imagine if it wasn't a pyramid structure through which we ran our organizations, but a series of concentric circles. And at the heart of the circle was the mission of the organization. Why does this organization exist? It exists to decrease violence against women. And then the next ring of the circle would be, who is it serving? Who does it exist for? Well, it exists for women, trans people who are experiencing violence of all kinds. And then the next ring of the circle would be, well, who is delivering the work? That might be the volunteers and the staff. And the next ring of the circle would be the board. How is this work being made accountable financially? And then legislators, and then the community at large, right? So you see the difference between a concentric circle model and a hierarchical model. And these are the kinds of conversations that we both wish happen much more in nonprofits. Conversations that are about how we can ensure that queer nonprofits act more clearly, that they operate more like transformation-oriented institutions, that they are themselves grounded in values of equity and social justice, that they develop methods to increase participation and internal democracy, that they're accountable to constituencies that they claim to serve, that those people have a voice in what is being worked on, and how do we democratize philanthropy, which is the power of wealthy people, and it is not a democratic system. It is not an open system. It's a very closed-door universe. I worked in it for 10 years. It does a lot of good things, but the people who make the decisions are very few. And they are not setting up consultative processes to hear from a bunch of people who are different from them. By and large, the decisions are funneled through small teams of staff, working with small teams of consultants, to even smaller teams of board members. So those are some of the kind of issues that I think arise out of the history and shift of nonprofits. And the larger question that I'm always struggling with in my work these days is, how are we going to build movements that can organize around economic policy and figure out a different way to do capitalism? At its core, that's the work of the queer movement. It's the work of the environmental movement. It's the work of the women's liberation movements. It's the work of the trans movement. There are other pieces of work, don't get me wrong. There's tons of things that we have to do, but when you get right down to the nub of it, for the next 40 years, we got to make a socially responsible capitalism. Okay, argue with me, Marxists. And that might be an impossibility, but that's what we got to do. And I don't know, I struggle that the nonprofit form, with its deep ties to the very system that we're trying to reform, may not be the mechanism to do it. Thanks.
having us here, and I'll be participating in the seminar. It's been a really amazing 2 days, and Hiroshi for always doing all these things with me that allow us to kind of have really juicy conversations with culture structures. It's good work and fun. So this conference that we organized in the fall, I want to tell you guys that one thing we did in it was we interviewed, we did like hours and hours and hours of interviews with people who came to present at the conference, and we're making all these videos about all these themes because a lot of people want to watch things in that format instead of doing things in books and long academic articles. So there's going to be a lot of, excuse me,
Sorry, I just want to make sure that the volume is
oh, cool. Can you guys hear? Okay, when I talk? No, not so much. Thank you.
Maybe you need to be closer.
Okay. Okay. Is it any better? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, so there's going to be just a bunch of videos about kind of the really deep, dirty details of some of the stuff that Hiroshi and I are talking about, both in terms of the dynamics of these problems and the dynamics of these cool things people are trying to disrupt and change and build alternatives. So I recommend this for the future. We'll put them out when they're done. But yeah, so this conference was about, really the impact of philanthropy and of the power of money on LGBT movements and on movements around HIV and on that set of work that's been happening for many decades that has been deeply impacted by nonprofitization and by the power of philanthropy to influence the agendas and the forms of the work we do. And I just want to kind of run through for you guys just some of the basic analysis that was key to the conference in case it's useful. So a lot of what we were trying to do too in building the conference was take a set of analysis that's really been strongly developed around the anti-violence movement and around anti-criminalization movements and really apply it to how it works in terms of LGBT and HIV work. So maybe some of you have run across the book "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded," which really has shaken up a lot of this and really exposing this analysis from a bunch of amazing activists and scholars. I recommend that as a tool for this conversation. It's an anthology with lots of different people's perspectives. But basically, one of the key points of that that I get out of that work and that set of conversations is that nonprofitization emerges in part as a response to the really transformative movements of the 1960s and 70s that articulated, anti-colonial, anti-racist politics, prison movements, feminist movements, anti-war movements of that period that were really, they were domestic, I'm talking about domestic movements, but that were linked into global struggles against colonization that were winning, right? That were kicking European colonizers out of countries that they had been controlling and harming, right? And so it was a very powerful, intense moment. And in the US, what that looked like was a lot of movements that were making really significant cultural impact and were using strategies like deeply critical of the police, deeply critical of the military, and using strategies that were actually really threatening to the status quo, right? They were engaged in armed self-defense of the indigenous people engaged in armed self-defense of their land from the US government, people in Black communities engaged in armed self-defense against the police, things that were scary to the US government and were really meaningful, deep strategies of change, and that also had wide, broad impact, right? So people were really rebelling in lots and lots and lots of places in lots of ways, and also trying out a lot of new cultural forms, some of which we remember now in a very limited way as represented as 60s subculture stuff, that actually had very deep political meaning that was about people really rethinking white supremacy, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, big stuff. And so groups that come to mind the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, but many, 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 many groups beyond that were, I think, a real threat and were in a widespread way disruptive to the status quo of the United States. And the response of the US government was twofold. Famously, right, the COINTELPRO era, right, which obviously is completely ongoing, right, the aspect of literally criminalizing, assassinating the leaders of those movements. Many of them are still in prison now, and of course we remember who died during that time, right? The United States is still involved in this, in this kind of attack on movement activism, but there's a very sharp period where we see the attacks, particularly on the Black Power movement, on the anti-prison movement, et cetera, American Indian movement. So that was one. That's Dylan Rodriguez talks about how there was a carrot and a stick, right? That's the stick. The carrot was the development of a new form of funding social movements to do the work in non-threatening ways, right? So the nonprofit form itself, we have to remember what it does is it lets rich people shelter their wealth from taxation and then use it to pay for their favorite pet projects. As Hiroshi just laid out, they don't mostly use it to pay for transformative change. They use it to like name a building at Smith College and to donate to their favorite opera and all that stuff, which is cool stuff, you know what I mean? But like, it's not mostly going to like make sure people have food and like that, you know, they're not being raped in prison. That's not where they're going. Or talk about such a tiny, tiny percent, because anything we would remotely say is like about the most urgent conditions people face in white supremacy and capitalism telecoms, right? So the carrot and the stick is, you know, destroying and dismantling radical social movements, and then also trying to transform them by changing their form through a new way that they're going to be funded. So you have this growth and nonprofitization of a bunch of movements, right, across the board, and we see suddenly, and I want to keep this in mind, radical transformative work that doesn't reach the level of getting paid for still goes on, but there's suddenly this new realm of work that's, you know, really tied into corporations and family foundations and to wealthy people and sometimes to government funding, and that gets a new kind of visibility and is the new face of what we're going to say social justice is. That's very controlled and captive neutralized. An example of this that really has been useful to look at, the one that kind of I think is where this analysis has been most thoroughly done, is in the anti-violence movement, as I mentioned. I recommend a book called The Color of Violence. That's also an anthology from the organization Insight. That book really details specifically a dilemma that the anti-violence movement broadly is facing in the United States right now, which is that for the past many decades, the movement was really, you know, there was this essential moment, right, of feminists naming family violence and violence against women as violence, not as something that's just fine and okay, right? This kind of is a really transformative, right, shift there, and that's what possible social movements do, is they even name violence, right? That is something that is a problem. And so feminists do that, and they're doing all these grassroots brilliant strategies to try to support people facing these things, try to help people get out of dangerous situations, try to make people safer. And then at the same time, there's a giant trend in the United States towards building and drastically expanding our criminal punishment system and further criminalizing things. And those things went hand in hand, and suddenly there was federal funding towards domestic violence related work if it was about criminalizing. So we've had, you know, 40-ish years of that strategy, and throughout that entire period, immigrant women, women of color, indigenous women, all, you know, lots and lots of people for whom the police are never a solution to violence, or actually a source of solution, bring greater vulnerability to harm, have opposed that strategy and said, we can't use services shaped around calling the cops. We can't, you know, we get deported, right? There are those kinds of conversations that are happening. But I think there's even a broader awareness happening now, even among people who are resistant to that critique, that this strategy has not worked. That it hasn't reduced the endemic violence against women and interpersonal violence in our society. And so this, the nonprofitization analysis was really particularly useful because it kind of it's a place where you see how that became such a popular strategy, how that became the only strategy anybody could imagine, how it seemed like what it meant if you cared about women was it meant you raised felony penalties for domestic violence, right? How did those two things, the thing the state already wanted to do, which was grow imprisonment criminalization, come to seem like a feminist agenda, right? So that's the right, these are this complicated moment that we're in to take stock of kind of how we got here and where we're going. So in terms of the LGBT movement, right, we can tell a related story. Obviously, I'm going, you know, fast and loose here, but we can talk about the details you want to later, right? So if you see, look at the 1960s and 70s moment, you also see an LGBT movement that has a real depth when it comes to concern about policing, or we think about these incendiary moments, the Stonewall Rebellion, the Compton cafeteria riots. It's queer and trans people fighting back against the cops, who were like a huge source, as they remain, of violence in our lives, right? And a lot of people in those movements in that moment, the things that Rishi was talking about, the kind of volunteer-based, very horizontal associations people were engaging in, a lot of them were also, like Rishi, engaged in women's movement, or people were also engaged in the anti-war movement. They were engaged in a variety of anti-racist and anti-colonial movements. A lot of that analysis was floating between these places, and in many ways, a lot of the LGBT analysis was supported or created by those interacting movements. So it's kind of shocking and intense when you see that like 30 or 40 years later, we end up with a really different agenda, right? An agenda that becomes about becoming included in the very institutions that the movements of that period sought to dismantle, right? Namely, the U.S. military, the institution of marriage, and the police and criminalization. So that's a really intense thing. Like, how did that happen, right? Like, that's big, right? So for doing that analysis, this nonprofitization analysis is a really important part of that. I just want to say, right? So this inclusive agenda that we're living in now, where almost the only LGBT agenda that you can see visible at all is one that's about becoming included in apparatuses of colonial, racial, gender violence, right? That agenda is really harmful, right? It does several things. When we seek inclusion in institutions, we have to do this set of talking points that's about saying how great the institution is and how we deserve to be part of it, right? So whenever it's like, we deserve to be in the military because we're good people and we're patriots and all of that, right? And because the military is a great job that we deserve to have. Of course, the reality of the military is a place that's full of racism where sexual violence is entirely part of the work conditions people live in. Not to mention what they do, right? What the military does all over the world and has done for over 100 years. So, we lift up these things. Hate crimes law, same thing. We lift up the police as people who are going to protect us, which is totally at odds with our wisdom in our communities about the extreme danger we face in the hands of the police, right? Or marriage. We lift up marriage as a wonderful way for us to care for each other and have romantic love when we have this, thousands of years of feminist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist analysis about how marriage is a technology of social control used for, ethnic cleansing processes and anti-black racism, et cetera, right? So we see this moment where we lift up institutions that our movements have fought so hard to do really thoughtful analysis of and try to kind of take apart and literally materially dismantle so they won't harm our lives as much. And then we also, the other talking point is we deserve to be in it. We're the right kind of people. So then you get the representation of, I swear to God, we're all white families who are monogamous and want to, and make a lot of money and want to adopt children. Do you know what I mean? And so we get that, which is really harmful within our communities because a lot of times those talking points for inclusion tend to be anti-black, anti-people on welfare, all the typical public enemies of the United States become, our talking points have to align so we can show that we're rights deserved, right? So there's been, I'm just like really summarizing something that's like a whole world of critique by zillions of activists and scholars, right? There's been all this harm, right? As this agenda has conservatized, because it's kicked out so many people out of feeling included. Trans people are one example of that. Literally, like, you're too embarrassing, you can't be part of our thing, like, for decades, and now there's like a creeping in of like mild fake inclusion, right? But there's so many of those histories, right, of those kinds of exclusion, in order to kind of shore up this deservingness, and then this embrace of these institutions that still harm us, right? That are still doing the same harm. So that what happens is this weird thing where we see LGBT politics actually become a frontline location of things, of key state investments, key existing state investments, right? A great way to make that, like, if we declare that women can serve in combat and LGBT people can serve in the U.S. military, then maybe the U.S. military is a beautiful site of liberation and equality, right? Like this kind of rebranding on our backs that doesn't actually get us much that's really good, right? Because, as I mentioned, being in the military is a terrible job, and also things like, our problems aren't solved by marriage, unfortunately, right? Like, most people who don't have an immigration status don't have a partner who has it. Most people who don't have health insurance don't have a partner who has it, right? Less and less people can get those things all the time because of the directions of neoliberal economic policy and border control and criminalization that she was referencing, right? And so we have this dilemma where the wins don't win us. They win us crumbs, and we've abandoned this important strategic moment we were in, right? That I think we can see in the 1960s and 70s comparison, where, for example, in that period, you saw feminists, and ongoing into the 80s, you saw feminists talking about the problems of marriage, saying, let's make less stuff depend on marriage. Let's literally go in and make it easier for women to get out of marriages. Let's have more no-fault divorce. Let's see if we can make key benefits people need not be dependent on marriage, because one of the long-term anti-black strategies in the United States was to make illegitimacy of children a way to keep people from having benefits, and it was particularly targeted at black families, and it was anti-racist lawyers who fought to just, take that away and reduce the importance of marriage to people accessing benefits. So all of that really brilliant work kind of gets thrown out the window because other strategies are suddenly chosen, which is let's just get in there. Let's just get a piece of the pie for those who have something to give. If you have something to inherit, you want to share it. If you don't, this one does nothing for you, sorry, because we're gonna go get the thing. I want my partner in my house. You know what I mean? So you get this kind of, this moment where the strategy shifts, and part of what we want to talk about at the conference is the ways in which the nonprofit forum and philanthropy get to choose the strategy. And that's weird. That's not people having a democratic process about how we can meet the greatest needs of our communities and having that choose the strategy. It's something else. It's a few really wealthy people influencing the strategy. So, and so that's where we are today, right? Where there was this burst of enormous support, which of course, as she says, is small in the real, in the world of all the support that exists for everything, but is in our communities a very big burst of support for one agenda, and the other work goes on, right? But this is the only thing you've ever heard of. So that now we have a moment where to be anti-homophobic is synonymous with being pro-military, pro-marriage, and pro-police. How did that happen, right? That's intense. I'm sorry if it's depressing, but it's we have to face it, right? And that how did the sort of left and feminist and anti-war and anti-military and anti-police analysis completely dry up in our movements and become erased and become taboo, right? So part of this that we talk about is the nonprofit leadership framework, the ways in which nonprofits, as Virtue is organized, as I was talking about, are organized in a corporate structure and really inherit that, and they do things like hire people who come from really fancy schools, right? There's like a way in which what's valued inside the nonprofit in terms of who should be leaders is the same thing that's valued inside corporations. And that's different from our community values, where we might say people should be hired because they really understand the system because they've lived through its worst harms, right? We might say educational privilege is not the same thing as wisdom, right? We have really radical other ideas about knowledge and power, right, inside our communities. And those processes, as she said, inside the nonprofits are incredibly undemocratic. You know, it's small boards that are, you get on a board by being someone who raise a lot of money, and that's how the agenda is decided, and that's how hiring and firing works. And you just have the total fallout. Maybe you have like, some aid service organizations have like one client board member, right? And that kind of organization where that person doesn't really have the same level of voice. That's a very typical sort of structure. And where social justice becomes a career path rather than something everyone's supposed to be doing all their lives, right? Like, in order to build movements to actually make change, you need millions of people, right? But the stories of important movements in the U.S. have been re-narrated as if it was just a few charismatic individuals and organizations, right? But in reality, that is incredibly safe. It's very safe for them to let a few charismatic individuals work in organizations and have most of us like be asleep on papers with a write a check once in a while, right? That is not actually threatening to the status quo. And so what the nonprofitization has done is it's focused LGBT, it's focused queer dreams on just elite solutions. Victory is only court wins, policy wins, maybe an article in the New York Times, getting something on TV. Victory is not anything to do with actually grassroots, massive mobilization and organization that at very local levels pushes for things that are actually unimaginable to the status quo, which are the kind of things we actually need, right? So, as I said, of course, the Racial and Economic Justice Center, Anti-Colonial Center, and LGBT work, queer work, trans work has gone on, right? It can continue going. It just does. It isn't on blast, right? It's not. It doesn't have like the same level of microphone or of amplification that money brought the other agenda. And this in the work that goes on there, people are using forms that are really about grassroots change. And I just want to name that because the kind of alternatives, it's partly that people are also rediscovering alternatives and inventing alternatives. It's also stuff we've used all along, right? Like the kinds of projects Urshi was talking about being really popular when she was first engaging are the same kinds of forms, like people who are involved in organizations that have never been funded and that just do their work through community groups, which is also the way I got my start. Through organizations that were just like, people are getting together and trying to work on something. We're having art projects about it, we're creating events, we're going to create some publications, or we're going to do an action, we're going to shut down a government building, we're going to stop the deportation bus, all of that, right? That's the kind of stuff that's going on. And also people are doing work inside nonprofits, trying to figure out how to horizontalize those spaces, right? So try to figure out, people are using strategies like having places that are run on consensus, classic feminist anti-racist strategies, doing hiring that's not based on educational privilege, having flat pay scales, having economic and budgetary transparency, using membership-based models where the members are people who are directly affected and they decide the agenda and priorities of the organization, right? This is not rocket science. This is, farm workers movement, civil rights movement, this is stuff we've heard of, but it's really meaningful right now because it's so far out of vogue from this model that is the most visible one where we're all waiting for like somebody to graduate from Harvard who knows the answer to poverty and then they'll just deliver it and that'll do it, right? That's the fantasy it's not happening. I want to recommend to you guys a report that the Sylvia Rivera Law Project put out with a bunch of other groups recently called From the Bottom Up, and it's just based on some research we did with groups that we think are doing this kind of work in interesting ways. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of some of the ways groups are solving all the hard problems of doing this work in that way, it's a fun resource. But the bottom line that I just want to share, right, so is that the bottom line is that rich people aren't going to fund the end of wealth. Right? They're not going to fund the transformation we need to have everybody have what they need, which that's what my goal is, to have everybody have what they need, nobody locked in a cage, nobody second quarter, right? like that seems not hard to imagine, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine because we're so far from it, but it's not hard to know that that's what we want. But we are, that as a desire has definitely been, it's hard to see right now. So if we need these huge movements, we need this deep change, we know that those kinds of movements have to center people who've been cast as disposable, right? The nonprofit strategy doesn't center people who've been cast as disposable, it centers people who want to hurt, right? That's the brilliant mind we need, right? And we need organizations that are accountable to constituents, not to funders, which is the opposite. When you're chasing the grant, you're like, well, what does someone want to hear? What do they want to hear now? They're going into this realm. I guess we have to go to that. I mean, that's the game it produces, right? We have to build the world that we actually want to live in, and you can't build it using like severely hierarchical, racist structures. Using those doesn't dismantle those. Like that's just it done, right? But like we know it is a really big deal right now. And I think that's the dilemma that we were trying to get at the conference, right? And we brought together the group of people who are doing this in different ways. I mean, there's not like one clear answer to this. And I think, one of the essays I really love in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded is Eric Tang's essay about complementary structures. Like, smart movements use multiple strategies and structures at the same time, right? Sometimes they use front nonprofits to get some money out of some international data board, and then, but the accountability is never in a nonprofit, right? It's like movements can have institutions that they produce, but institutions don't produce movements, right? It's a very different thing. And I think that's the dilemma. So it's like, how do we get where we are right now, which is there's been some really, really effective strategies for depoliticizing all of us, neutralizing us, and making us believe there are no alternatives to the way things are right now. That's working, right? And so then what do we do to imagine practicing in a very immediate way work that doesn't abide by those rules, right? And that actually makes things what we want it to be. And that's, I think, the dilemma that we're really facing.
It's funny, Dean, when I was hearing you this time, I thought, wow, how many conversations I've sat in foundations where we're talking about movement building. And actually, to your last sentence about, institutions do not produce movements, some institutions think they do. And there are legions of documents that are strategies of foundations that are about, well, this is our strategy for movement building, for this and that movement. And what's complicated is, of course, the funding enables certain work to be done, which is good work. And yet, the funding also controls the direction, contains the work, and de-radicalizes it inevitably. It just does. You can't say certain things in a grant. I'm here to tell you that. I've sat on both sides of the desk. If you start talking about world revolution or the kind of talk we're talking about here, it's less likely to get funded unless it's an exceptional individual funder who's got the same values.
Or even if you're just talking about like working with drug users or working with people who just throw in the sex trade, right? I mean, like that. It's like the level of policing is so intense. I mean, I should have said this. The book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, came from a conference that Insight did, and the reason they did the conference is because they had a grant from Ford to do a bunch of work, and then somebody at Ford looked through their website and found their statement in solidarity with Palestinian women and canceled their grant. I mean, it's literally like a gag order, And so, I mean, I think I think part of what we're trying to do, those of us who are trying to build these kinds of like alternative structures, we're trying to build structures that are sustainable even while the money dries up, right? But we're also doing a lot of things like grassroots fundraising and figuring out ways to have money that isn't from like the elite or isn't from, because then if one person's responsible for 40% of your budget and they don't like what you did because they don't want you to work with drug users or undocumented people or whatever it is, that's a lot of vulnerability. So we want to build structures where even if there are some people who are getting paid, like SRLP is an interesting example. There's like a few staff people at SRLP. Thank you. There's some staff people, but the collective structure is about having lots of people doing the work, and some staff people facilitate certain things, especially things like legal services where you have to like be in an office all day and answer, like go to court. There's very like things that make it hard to have another job while doing that. But like the idea is that even while the money went away, yes, the services would have to change, but the organization wouldn't end because there's lots of people doing the work. It's not just a staff. it's not, everybody's not just doing this only as their career. It's like the idea, man, there's a model I used from Fierce, which is like a youth group organization in New York. They have a model that's like a target. It's interesting with concentric circles. It's like a target, and it's like they're thinking about always trying to bring more and more people into the organization, into the center. So the outermost realm is like people who are in the general constituency who Fierce has never met. And then there's like the next ring, which is like people who've come to some Fierce rally or an event or a meeting once. And there's people who like come kind of consistently and are like beginning to form a relationship with the organization. And then there's people who are like member leaders, who are like actively working to bring people in, right? And so the idea is to keep moving people through this, and people along the way are getting like explicit skills, like people, they have a lot of political development workshops and workshops about how to do fundraising, and workshops about how to, plan a rally, right? Like trying to bring people in, build them skills, and have them become organizers, who then bring more people in. And also a lot of people who become organizers through Fierce go on to work with lots of other organizations and other movements, right? And that kind of model of like maximally bring people in instead of the elite model of like, you're not smart enough to be here, or only people who got this kind of degree, or only people like this can get hired. Like that's the reverse of movement building. And that's what the dilemma is for like corporate model.
I also want to, I want to make one more point, and then perhaps we should check. You can respond, you can open it up. And that is that Dean and I work on these sets of issues in different ways, and have over the course of our friendship with each other and our relationship with each other as comrades in the movement. In the sense that I've worked on the inside of a lot of these big infrastructures, and trying to reform from inside. And I have to agree with Audre Lorde, paraphrased by Dean, the master's tools will not bring down the master's house, right? Which she said famously. And on the other hand, it won't bring it down, but the presence and your participation in those large institutions does make a difference. So I'm of the school of thought that both and. If you're in there, you can still be critical, but you've got to be critical. The tendency to get co-opted is real, it's major, and it's constant in any major institution that you try to enter as a worker, leader, volunteer, whatever. Dean's done a lot of brilliant work in building alternatives. I mean, I've done that too. We're both doing that. But I think that there's it's not an either or in some ways, but it is a tension, right? It's a tension that we talk about and argue about, because as lawyers, both of us, this conversation about nonprofitization is so deep, because it implicates everything. It's really about strategies for change. How do we make change? What is the mechanism for that, right? We both worked on litigation and cases, so we believe in some ways that representing people and fighting against these systems to change them, whether it's a welfare system or a school system or whatever, is important. But then, that's not, neither of us sees those wins as the end point. Neither of us has ever seen formal legal equality as the end point. We see, that was beautifully phrased. I wrote it down. Everybody have what they need, nobody locked in cages, nobody stopped and reported. That is very concise. But we both believe that lived equality is the goal. Like living the experience of equality, whatever that is, more important than formal legal equality. And it's different. So I don't know, I just think about it. I think we talk about that tension.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, the tension of the conference is too that this conversation makes people really uncomfortable and defensive for good reasons. We've been working on nonprofits our whole lives. Whatever. That's, of course it's uncomfortable. And the question is, can we have humility? Can we be yeah, I've been doing a lot of stuff, and I can see the parts of it that were really awesome, and the parts of it where I was really, where I was hemmed in, or where what I could even imagine we could do was hemmed in by certain conditions. And that doesn't make me a bad person, doesn't make anybody who works in a nonprofit a bad person. Usually people are there because they're really passionate about something. But can we look at the conditions and then figure out, is there something we can steal here? Is there something what are the things?
Is there something we can appropriate?
Yeah, what are the possibilities in the spaces we're in? And also, what are the things that are not possible? What is banging your head against the wall endlessly? And those conversations are, there's not a clear answer to that. So for us, it's oftentimes that's a fight between us or inside ourselves, right? What does it mean to be inside an institution and be really letting yourself feel your critique and experience it and talk to others about it and join about it, and not being so worried about defending ourselves that I'm a good person. It's yes, we're all good people. If we all just yes, we're good people, then can we open up the possibility of critical conversation? And it's not about like insulting each other's work at all. It's just about recognizing that we are in a really, we're in a pickle that's created by really large forces, you know? And the other thing I want to say too is that this comes up as well about the question about how to do survival work while having a big critique of big systems, right? So this is a huge issue for the prison abolition movement. We are a movement, right, that wants to abolish prisons, which is a really giant project that a lot of people find really unimaginable and huge, and some people scary, and there's lots of like intense racism around the reactions to that, whatever. And at the same time, so we're all people who know that there's nothing redeemable about the project of caging people. And there are people in cages right now, and we want to support them. And that is not a contradiction. But it means that as we do that work, we have to do it thoughtfully. So we don't choose strategies that say they're going to support prisoners, but actually just expand the prison system. And we do focus on making sure individual prisoners have tons and tons of support as much as possible to survive the situation they're in. And the prison system always wants to expand itself by saying that it's going to be good for prisoners to build more prisons, right? And so that tension is in everything, right? Same with the welfare system. I want people to make sure that they get their welfare checks, and I think the system of welfare is racist and designed to control poor people and everyone. So I want to build a world in which we don't need it, and right now I want to help you get your check too, right? And like that tension and the complexities in there, they create the tension you're talking about because they make us have to analyze which strategies we're going to use for which things in a given moment. And does this strategy, which might get this person right now, does it just kind of do that, and yeah, I'm using this shitty system, but it doesn't have a bigger harm? Or does this would actually help cause a bigger harm or feed the system in some problematic way? And we don't always know the answer to that. Sometimes we're wrong, you know. But like even getting to the point where we can be non-defensive enough to have that conversation and to be that like thoughtful and strategic about kind of the stakes of what we're up against. Like I think that's like that's why I think we enjoy having those arguments. It's because it's like it's humble. It's like wow, we don't know what's going to happen next. What's going to solve things, and we're desperate to solve them, so we're going to like talk it out endlessly and try things, right? Do you guys want to talk?
Well, thank you for being here. I'm a gay man, married with 2 children, adopted, but I'm not going to go there. I've got another question. It's not really related, but you talk about capitalism. I also have a sister who's a nun, and she's a radical Catholic. So I'm wondering if you looked at that model and maybe what you think of it. She also was involved in a big conference that a previous pope came out saying they were right down on all these nuns. And, you know, they had an argument and they met and I think he backed down. But also she lives a very communal, non-capitalist, I would say, lifestyle. And of course we know there are prison reform movements and things. So I'm just wondering if that's a model you look at and maybe what you could say about the history of nuns and especially nuns, I guess I won't say talk about priests, but just curious about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll get a few, let's get a few comments in and then we can go there.
Yeah.
So what I was wondering from this conversation, and this is partly informed by the whole kind of ruckus in India right now about like criminalization of homosexuals, like decriminalization, then decriminalization, and who does this particular law kind of, pertain to? So without going into that debate, the question which comes out of that particular context, but I think is more broadly kind of also relevant is, what are the pros and cons of law as a strategy in terms of, fighting these battles? And there, how far can, the recourse to law as part of, fighting these battles for rights, how far is that movement itself generated of a certain kind of language which legitimizes the notion of a legitimate citizen as opposed to a criminal. So I was wondering, is this are in the field that comment on that?
All right, we'll just go for it. You're being shy, but it's okay. The Catholic social justice tradition is an incredible one. Social Catholic workers, right? Dorothy Day. There's a whole sort of progressive history of organizing around poverty. I I guess that's what you're referencing for the nuns. I don't know exactly how to speak about that, but I think that the I think that when I say socially responsible capitalism, I'm thinking in a much more mundane way and less intense way than your sister and others are working on it in some ways. They've made an enormous personal commitment and sacrifice in some ways, right? And financial and others. But I think that most people are working in environments where we have to raise our voices to point out the inequality of the system and to take actions to mitigate it. I'm kind of a pragmatist, right? And I'm an idealist. And what that means is that many of you are going to go on to have good jobs in situations where, and hopefully many of you are going to go on to have powerful positions, perhaps. And I think it's going to be really critical for you to ask yourself, what is this institution doing, right? I'm sure you're asking that right now. You're asking yourselves that at Smith. You're asking yourself that at your classes. But if you keep, my theory is that if more of us keep asking that question, we're going to be able to be in those positions to turn those decisions around. Right now, political power is in the hands of the code breakers. And meaning they're just a symbol. They're not, again, they're just a symbol of a ideological position that is saying that, no burden should be placed on corporations because they are the salvation of everything. If you don't believe that, so the political power rests in a different place right now. So I'm naive enough to think that one can have political organizing and political engagement that wrestles that power out of those hands, whether it's done in a local community or in a state government or in a region and eventually the federal. And so that's one strategy that I feel is my answer to your question about, everybody isn't going to go and be that kind of nun. And not that you were suggesting that, but I think that there is stuff to be learned from advocates and organizers and histories of people who've been working on this labor movement.
I thought you were suggesting that there would have to be a real restructuring of the economy, so that I was looking, if you're talking.
Sure.
It sounds like now you're saying that we have capitalism and we've got to work with it, but I'm thinking of a more grassroots, communal, socialist kind of approach, which I think of these groups of nuns really is kind of being that. On the other hand, I was going to ask you, I lived in Boston too in the 80s, and that first job you had as a secretary, were you out in that firm?
Yeah.
Okay, because when I was working in Boston, I wasn't. And so I look now at the change in the private sector, and it's hard not to see the evolution as a very happy, nice change from when I was working 30 years ago to now. And when we look at what we see in big companies, whether it's Microsoft or IBM, any of them, all of them, from big to little corporations, capitalist places, the outreach and the things they have for employees in this movement, it's remarkable. So I don't suppose you're diminishing the great impact, the great change that we've seen, or the foundation, like the Gates Foundation, these huge philanthropic places that are. I'm just curious what you would say, because they're working on things, of course, that are, I guess, very similar to the types of things you're talking about. Maybe
Well,
it's
I
a
think
drop
what
in the bucket.
I think what we're trying to, we're not giving a triumphalist narrative of the gay liberation movement today, but and there are many triumphs, and I have worked my ass off to achieve many of those wins. So I take great personal pride and great satisfaction in the fact that there's more space created for LGBT people. But what we're pointing out is that there is still a lot of space that needs to be created for more parts of our communities, number one, that the work isn't done, that the work of changing certain institutions and not other institutions has been made, is a choice that has been made that has some consequences. And that's more where we're going, rather than saying this is good work, that's bad work, because yeah, it's phenomenal. It's different, and it's beautifully different, and may it grow more different. But it's been problematic.
I think what I would add is that, like, and this relates to, because I have a different take on the possibility of socially responsible capitalism, but it relates to your point, which is that how is it that we can account for the fact that major institutions of capitalism could come to pass gay-friendly policies at the same time that they more effectively exploit labor around the world, destroy the earth, and like harm everything? And how could that not be like that? So maybe that makes us raise our eyebrows and be like, oh shit, the thing we didn't, somehow what we were demanding became narrowed in a way that actually may benefit a few people who can work at IBM, right? But we need to look more deeply at what IBM does, right? And right, so I think that's the kind of analysis we're asking for. And it relates, I just want to talk for a second about the way you open by sharing your identities, because one of the things I think sometimes happens when we talk about this stuff is that people think it's about a critique of their individual identities and choices. And it's not about not thinking about our identities and choices, because all of our identities and choices are political, because as feminists taught us, the personal is political. So my desires about how I organize my personal life, the fact that your sister's desires and the way she's organized her life are so non-normative in a way that's, I think, pretty cool and interesting to hear about, right? Like, when I do organize my life towards certain norms, we see that there are systems of social control that push me towards that, and we also see that I have agency and responsibility in that. And that's a complicated conversation that cannot be reduced to judgment and defensiveness. It's really about, like, wow, we're in systems, we're responsible for the system because we co-create them and we enforce them on one another and on ourselves, and we're affected by them in ways that sometimes we do things to survive and be well, right? So I just want to, like, kind of name that, because I think, anyway, I sense that. But I want to answer your question because it's so related to all of this, the role of law, right? Like, I think I actually had this conversation maybe before the field. You know, it relates to the thing about how can we see transformation happening that we're told are the victories, and then have conditions that we remain very disturbed by. So, like, in the United States, there's this intense narrative about the civil rights movement and how it resolved racism, right? And that, what I think those of us who are activists now can learn is, wow, how is it that racism can become illegal and prohibited according to United States law during the same period where the prison system quintuples and the immigration system quadruples, and that all the apparatuses of racialized violence that the United States uses inside the United States and outside the United States drastically expanded and were practiced? Like, how does that comport with the idea that racism became illegal when conditions worsened so severe? Like, I mean, even just the racial wealth divide in the United States and the wealth divide generally worsened so significantly during the same period when supposedly this stuff was made illegal. So that, for me, is like a really basic place to be like, huh, what do laws do and not do? And I think this relates to how we think about how LGBT agendas emerge about law. And the sodomy question is an interesting one, because I think for many of us, we can look at what has been the intervention of the mainstream, as where the uses, or I would say like the well-funded or white LGBT formation. What has been their intervention around criminal law? It's been decriminalizing sodomy and passing hate crimes laws. Turns out most queer and trans people who are in prison because of the drug war and because they're poor. But the LGBT, that kind of movement formation doesn't have talking points on that, really, right? Like, that's not considered a gay issue. So how does this politics become like single issue and narrowed in that way? Not to say that sodomy laws are a good thing. I'm not into them. They're a bad thing. But if we were doing a material analysis of people's well-being, they wouldn't be where we stopped, and we certainly would ask questions about hate crimes laws, which enhance the punishing power and material resources of the police and prison system, which are the primary perpetrators of violence against our communities. So I think that that's like the kind of questions that a lot of us are asking, and I think this is particularly important to think about globally, because the U.S. is engaged really deeply, and this foundations are taking, U.S. LGBT foundations are really turning towards the gay international frame right now, right? And they're like, how can we solve homophobia all around the world by passing same-sex marriage and eliminating sodomy laws in other countries? And how can we also, convenient to U.S. imperialism, call countries that haven't done those things homophobic. Meanwhile, queer and trans people in the United States are not doing well, but this isn't about well-being, it's just about what laws say. How can we call those countries homophobic as an excuse to engage in military intervention on them, which is the point of Hillary Clinton's speech about how gay rights are human rights, right? She doesn't care about queer and trans people who are dying in the United States from homophobia and transphobia every day. What she cares about is who they can bomb, right? And what markets they can open. And so I think that this is a deep moment for us because it can feel like it's affirming, you know? Like it's so affirming when like the police or the president or somebody says something pro-gay. And I'm just like, let's look behind it. And this analysis, you know, has been called paint washing. This is like a really important term that critical activists around the world are using for this, and it's primarily been used around talking about Palestine, because the government of Israel has been super brilliant in marketing itself as a human rights protecting country over the last 5 or 10 years, specifically by saying we're good on gay, we let gays serve in the military, etc. And they have the Israeli government has funded gay activists to go all around the U.S. and promote promote Israel as this human rights loving country to combat this worldwide intense reputation that Israel has as this horrible settler colonial apartheid state, right? So this is an intense situation where gay rights, which again, just what laws say, not what's actually happening to queer and trans people anywhere, are like the new window dressing, just in the same way that faux feminism is the window dressing for the war in Afghanistan and has been for every colonial project we're going to come here and save your women, right? So I think there's just like, that's related to the fetishization of legal equality, and I think it's also, for me, it's an urgent call for us to become more critical about this because it's such a popular strategy right now for our government and governments around the world that are doing harm.
I so recommend Dean's book, Normal Life, on this issue around the limits of the law. Because, as Dean says, taking the critique from critical race theory and applying it to queer trans politics, Dean does a really clear job of showing the limits of a legal rights strategy. And again, the argument is not, therefore don't have legal rights, but just the idea of putting it in its proper context and understanding what it does and doesn't do, and the difference between rights and law as your goal and well-being as your goal. It's just, it's just a different endpoint. And well-being takes you into domains of family and work and maybe even religion and non-legal, governmental domains as well, which I think one of the critiques that comes up to the human rights community from South African activists or African activists about human rights is that the framework of sexual orientation and gender identity alone doesn't do the work that queer South Africans need it to do. They need to also incorporate issues of poverty or health or HIV or a bunch of other things that are going on the ground, violence that has to be addressed. So you're absolutely right to bring up this question about what does it mean in India to have a decriminalization effort. But let me argue the liberal side, from my liberal brain, and defend that. And that is that I'm a Libra, so I'm going to argue. Kate says I'm an Indian Libra, so I can argue. There's not just on the one end or the other. But the one positive thing that I've seen in this whole fight so far is that one of the positive things is that a lot of people who've never uttered a word about the existence of LGBT people in India are speaking up. And when an officially negative thing happens, it forces the question to liberal people in whatever country it happens in. And if that helps build some support, that would be really productive. Because the queer movement in India, as you know probably, is vibrant, it exists, as does a feminist movement. And yet it's very much in development, in conflict with each other about what the ultimate goal should be. There's differences. There's really a lot of thinking going on.
I think this is the classic thing of being able to do a migrant from the Indian to American. Like when I was in India, I went to American thinking going down to USC, and we would go up to USC, come to the moment, and And when you're from India moving to America, and you know where's the movement? Well, that's a cuisine. So and I even kind of heard like a friend say, like, you know, after moving from India to America, like, thank God you're first. And it says something about, you know, like what preconceptions are, because as you move to the spaces, we are still stuck in a telos of development of this peace point, you know, how like human rights, like this promoter of human rights globally, as telos of development where the assumption is that surely if you move from Africa or India to America or anywhere in the West, you have this fantastic experience of liberation. But actually you have just lost your mood. And you're kind of like, and you now have this invitation to go to bars and spend money. So, this is not just what's going on, like there's also kind of other stuff going on, but in the here and now, like the 2000s, like that's very much kind of seems to be the disparity. And I actually, I agree with you in terms of the possibilities of, you know, the queer movement and where it is going. And this is kind of lovely to share because there were these national strategizing meetings and called over December. And in some ways it was a gift from the Supreme Court because if you ever had to time it in a way that, you know, like everybody from all over the world could be present in Delhi to strategize, you have to time it so that people could go there in December. It's kind of the Supreme Court sort of gift to the queer movement. So, and in terms of voices, it was very interesting watching this tension where a lot of people were there saying, because you have people from across the world. And that's kind of also related to how real these issues are. Some people say, I'm here because I'm gay. Right? And that is our common point. Can we not go into this? We cannot build an alliance like this. Because I actually don't agree with you. We don't work on the same thing about it. And you know, we don't have the same vision. And there were others who were saying that we are arguing for minority rights. How can we argue for one minority rights while we are validating all minority rights? And I think the question has not been decided in many ways, but it's kind of that. I think that it really reflects, you know, normalized kind of basic question of, you know, asking who are these people. So in terms of, you know, the situation was very real and being talked about, and I completely agree with you. That's what it's interesting. Where it's going to go.
I mean, in the U.S., I feel like if you want to win something, you have to throw people under the bus, right? Like it's like, I mean, you see this, like, I see these divides in the immigrant rights movement, right? About how the push to have an agenda that actually builds the border and makes it stronger and sells out people who don't have, who are never going to be on a path, a very narrow path of immigration that might be created by certain legislation, right? Or push to differentiate immigrants who are in a civil detention system from criminals or not criminals. In every movement, right? So in the gay movement, that's been, you know, coded language that's like, we're not, you know, we're citizens and we're not people on welfare, and criminals will be tax-paying people who buy a lot of, you know, consumer goods if you just let, you know. And I think that is an interesting dynamic. Like that, I thought it was interesting the way you like. It's the refusal of that we're in the same boat, you know. And I think that the nonprofitization question is for us, we can see an actual mechanism that creates a set of incentives towards a movement where you sell other people out. And I think for me, like setting other contexts, like particularly setting queer resistance in Palestine, where queer organizations there have really refused to take the money that would be available to them if they would buy into the Israeli narrative about how Israel is a place that protects gay people and even gay Palestinians, right? And then watching these activists refuse the money and being like, why can't people here do that? And they have, you know, so just thinking about how different movement contexts and different kinds of national conditions and lived conditions might produce different kinds of more or less radical strains inside queer politics.
Yeah, actually this follows well on that, which is to say, I wonder if you want to talk too about how we're not alone in this, right? That I've heard the critique of NGOification long before I heard the critique of the role of nonprofits within the U.S. And that we are not the activists who most experienced the harshest defeat or the greatest shrinking of the state, or particularly of welfare states, and their replacement with nonprofits or NGOs. And that there's a lot of good thinking in my experience going on in Latin America, because that's just the context I know, but also in some places in Africa, according to people I read, about really how to strategically simply take money here and there from NGOs without allowing your organization to be captured by the NGOs. And at the same time, you know, it seems like NGOification is a much sort of, I want to say, more effective at capturing movements project. And so this fight has a big scale, and there's a lot at stake for a lot of activists.
I mean, I think that for me, studying Latin American movements has become, you know, increasingly the urgent piece, and it's also the thing I provide my students in the classroom as like a balm, you know, to be like, wow, so this region has been dealing with a range of neoliberal economic policies for like maybe, you know, a really long time, and the resistance strategies are really wise to it. And so, I feel like it's been a place also where I've heard stories consistently of a strategic complementary use of something like an NGO as a way to, you know, build one particular project, but that's not accountable to the funder, right? That's accountable to the movement. And I think that that's right now very hard to imagine domestically. And I think that this analysis did come late to U.S. movements. Like it's certainly been the HIV movement for a very long time because of the strings attached by the Bush administration to HIV and sex ed, right? Like internationally, I think that I mean, it's part of the way that the U.S.
The Reagan administration.
Yes,
You were
yes.
already captured under
Yeah.
the Reagan administration, already arguing about it.
And I think that there's something about how people, activists in the U.S. are really disconnected from that global conversation, and also, like, I don't know what neoliberalism is. You know, there's a really deep sense of the activists in the U.S. or people in the U.S. are really protected from being like aware of a lot of the basic conditions of, you know, U.S. power in all those situations. It's obstacle.
I think that we might be at 5:30, and I want to respect everybody's time. And we're available to talk informally, and we thank you all so much for being here.